The storm came late that spring, sweeping in from the northern passes with a ferocity that startled even the oldest men in Elkalo. It tore down fences and turned the dry creeks to fast-moving rivers. When it reached the edge of the Wilkins homestead, it broke the spine of the main barn and drowned every new calf in the lower field. Sarah Wilkins buried them herself, one by one, sleeves soaked past the elbow, mud streaked across her cheek like war paint. She didn't cry, not when the rain kept on and not when it finally stopped. There was no one left to cry with. Her father had died the winter before, lungs gone brittle with dust, and her brothers had gone east for work, promising letters that never came. That left Sarah alone to hold the land with hands cracked and calloused, trying to keep alive the last piece of her mother's prayers. But even prayers couldn't patch a roof or turn seed into crop. By June, the bank man came. He was polite in that slick, worn-down way of men who live by numbers. He stepped around the chickens and held his hat to his chest like he pitied her, said the loan was long past due and the land would be reclaimed by autumn. Said she could leave now and spare herself the slow grief of watching it all get parceled off. Sarah stood barefoot on the porch and listened. She said nothing until he tipped his hat and walked back down the road. That night she sat in her father's chair by the fire, a sheet of figures spread across her lap. Her thumb traced the same line over and over, $23 short by month's end. No mule, no hired hands, no help. The fire crackled low, and still she stared. The next morning she hitched the old wagon and drove into town. Her Sunday dress was clean but faded, hem let out twice to keep pace with her legs. She wore her hair in a braid down her back, no hat. The townsfolk watched her pass, some with admiration, some with pity, none with surprise. Sarah Wilkins had always been her own kind of wild. She stopped outside the mercantile and stepped down, skirts brushing the dust. Inside, she asked for James Holt. He was mending a cracked boot behind the counter, sleeves rolled, a 3-day stubble softening his jaw. He didn't smile when he saw her, just nodded like he'd been expecting this visit in some shape or another. James had taken over his uncle's blacksmith shop after the war, and though he rarely spoke more than was needed, folks trusted him. Quiet men often hold the most steady kind of anger, and that steadiness had kept him alive long after many others fell apart. "I need a husband," Sarah said. It wasn't a joke, and she didn't flinch. She looked him in the eye like she was offering a trade of equal weight. James blinked slow. "You sure?" "I need the land to stay in Wilkins' hands. I need help to keep it working. I can cook, mend, and hold my own weight. You'll have a home. I won't ask for anything else." He leaned back on his heels, arms crossed. "You want a marriage of convenience. I want survival. Whatever else comes is between us and time." A long silence stretched between them. He looked at her then, not just the surface of her, stubborn chin, sun-bronzed skin, shoulders set like fence posts, but the place where her weariness lived. A kind of resignation that only comes after every other door has closed. Finally, he nodded. "I'll come by tomorrow. We'll speak to the preacher." They were married the following Sunday in the small white church that smelled of pine oil and damp hymnals. No guests, no flowers. Just the preacher, his wife as witness, and the hard press of wind against the stained glass. James placed the ring on her finger without a word. Sarah didn't cry. They returned to the Wilkins place in silence, the wagon creaking beneath their weight. That first night they slept in separate rooms, the sound of rain whispering on the roof, not as storm but as steady grace. They didn't touch, didn't talk much, just worked. James repaired the barn in long, silent stretches, and Sarah planted squash and beans, knees in the dirt, fingernails dark with purpose. Days moved like water down a slow bend, nothing dramatic, nothing soft. Just the necessity of effort, the slow weaving of two separate lives into a daily pattern. One morning she left coffee on the porch for him, steam curling like breath. He drank it without a word, left a horseshoe on the windowsill that night, polished clean. Neither thanked the other. Still, something passed between them, some small recognition of effort, of staying. It was not love, not yet, but it was beginning, and the storms weren't done. By the time July settled thick over the valley, the rhythms of their days had found a kind of order. James rose early, often before the light touched the tops of the cottonwoods, his boots thudding quiet across the floorboards. Sarah woke to the sound of the pump groaning outside, the tin cup he left on the porch still wet from his hands. They spoke little at breakfast. She laid out biscuits and eggs. He ate with a quiet reverence, chewing slow, shoulders slightly hunched as though waiting for something that never came. Their silences weren't awkward, only spacious, like the fields they now shared. Sarah kept to the garden mostly, and the kitchen. She repaired the hem of her one good dress by lantern light and stitched a new feed sack apron with hands that moved out of memory more than intention. James spent long hours in the barn, coaxing breath back into the rusted forge with patient blows, turning out hinges and blades for whoever came asking. They were not affectionate, not in the way folks might expect of newlyweds. There were no lingering glances, no touches stolen in passing, but something grew in the quiet, in the acts that replaced words. When Sarah found the kitchen door sticking, James planed it down smooth before dusk. When his shoulder ached after shoeing a farmer's mule, she left a liniment jar by his bed, warmed on the stove. They lived parallel lives, touching not at the center but at the edges, where small kindnesses gather like morning dew. The townsfolk had their say, of course. Marriages of necessity weren't unheard of, but they always drew whispers. Sarah heard them on market day, her name paired with his in low tones behind bolted doors and beneath parasols. Some said she'd trapped him, others that he was the one to make the offer, quiet and stern as a preacher's warning. She didn't correct them. What passed between her and James wasn't for the town to understand. The first test came not from nature but from man. In late July, a stranger rode up the road, dust-coated and lean, with a crooked smile that bent sharp at the edges. He called himself Ezra Pike and claimed to be hunting work. Said he'd come from Montana by way of Cheyenne, looking to trade labor for shelter. James didn't answer right away. He studied Ezra with the same patience he used for red-hot iron, waiting to see if it would bend or break. Sarah watched, arms crossed, chin tipped. Ezra's eyes lingered too long on her hands, her waist, her mouth. She saw it all. James said they didn't have coin for hired help. Ezra smiled, tipped his hat, and rode on. That night James nailed shut the chicken coop and moved the axe from the shed to the porch. He didn't speak of it, neither did she. But when he passed her the water bucket the next morning, their fingers brushed, just a breath, a fleeting touch. But it felt like thunder beneath still air. The days grew hotter. Sweat stained James's collar and Sarah took to tying her hair back in a rag to keep the heat from her neck. The work never slowed. If anything, it deepened, pulled them tighter into its rhythm. James began fencing the north pasture, and Sarah started baking bread again, real bread, not the flat ash cakes she'd lived on since winter. One evening, she caught him watching her knead the dough, arms buried up to the elbow in flour and memory. "Used to do this with Mama," she said, not looking up. She said hands tell truth when mouths won't. James didn't reply, but the corner of his mouth twitched, almost a smile. They ate that bread together by firelight, the crust warm and hard as bark, the inside soft as fog. James tore his piece carefully, like it was something holy. Sarah didn't speak, but her chest ached with something unnameable, something shaped like being seen. Later that week, the roof of the linta buckled. No storm, just age. James climbed up without a word, and Sarah steadied the ladder with both hands. When he slipped on a loose shingle, she gasped, sharp, real, raw, and he caught himself, arm twisted, breath knocked out of him. She didn't say what she'd been about to. He didn't ask. Instead, when the repairs were done, he sat on the porch beside her for the first time. "Was my uncle's place," he said, finally. "The smithy. He raised me after the war, wasn't kind. But he taught me how to hold a hammer." Sarah didn't speak. She just listened, the way wind does when you tell it your heart. "I used to dream of leaving," he said, "but I didn't, don't reckon I ever will now." She nodded once, then reached for the mug between them and handed it to him, her fingers grazing his again. They stayed like that a long time, not touching, not speaking, just breathing side by side in the cool dusk. It wasn't love, not yet. But it was closer. By the time August cracked the earth with its dry teeth, the Wilkins place had begun to look like something held together not by luck, but by sheer will. The fence posts stood firm now, each one tamped into place by James's hands, shoulders taut from days under the punishing sun. The squash vines curled thick and tangled across their rows, and Sarah's canned jars, rows of glistening peach and plum, began to line the pantry shelves like offerings against the lean season ahead. They still kept separate rooms, but some nights, when the wind carried the scent of wood smoke and drying grass, Sarah would hear the soft creak of the floorboards in the hallway and know that James, too, lay awake. Not restless, just listening. As if the house had taken on breath and they were learning to breathe with it. It was a dry spell that broke the routine. The well ran shallow by mid-month. The pump gave a hollow clank and then nothing. Sarah stood barefoot on the back stoop, bucket in hand, looking down the path as James approached from the field, dust rising around his boots like smoke. He didn't need to be told, just set his tools aside and nodded. By morning they were loading barrels into the wagon, bound for the creek 3 miles east. They went together. The ride was mostly silent, save for the creak of the wagon and the rustle of dry cottonwood leaves overhead. Sarah kept one hand braced on the bench, the other tucked beneath the edge of her apron. James drove with his eyes fixed forward, jaw set. At the creek they worked without speaking, hauling, pouring, wiping sweat from brows with dirt-stained sleeves. The air smelled of moss and iron. Somewhere upstream, a hawk called once and was answered only by the hush of branches swaying. When the last barrel was filled, Sarah sat on the bank, skirts bunched beneath her, feet bare in the water. James joined her after a long moment, not too close, not too far. The sun painted his skin bronze, and his hair stuck to his neck in damp curls she'd never seen before. "You ever think about children?" she asked, surprising even herself. He didn't look at her, just picked up a pebble and turned it in his fingers. "I used to," he said, "before." She didn't press him, though the ache in her chest twisted at the silence. "What about you?" he asked after a pause. She thought about it. About the way her mother's hands had held hers by lantern light, teaching her to swaddle a rag doll. About the cold winter she'd lost a brother not yet 10. About the loneliness of spring planting with no one to carry the other end of the sack. "I used to," she echoed, "but dreaming don't come easy anymore." James tossed the pebble. It skipped once, then sank. That night they ate by lantern light again. The air was thick with the memory of the creek, of words spoken and not. Sarah cleared the dishes slowly, her hands moving on their own. Behind her, James stood. "I'll check the barn," he said, voice low. She turned just enough to meet his eyes. "It can wait." Their gazes held, a breath, another, but he went anyway, leaving the screen door to clatter behind him. Rain came days later. Not a storm, just a steady wash of sky that turned the dust to paste and filled the troughs one trickle at a time. Sarah stood at the window and watched it fall, fingers wrapped around her mug. James worked outside until he was soaked through, repairing the fence line by the south pasture where a mule had pushed loose a board. When he returned, drenched and shivering, she met him with a towel and a silence thick with something more than concern. He let her dry his shoulders, let her rub warmth back into his hands. He didn't speak. Neither did she. But the air between them felt different now, charged, like the air before a storm, though this one had no thunder. Later, in the hush of the kitchen, Sarah said, "You don't have to do it all alone." James looked at her, really looked. As if seeing her anew. "I'm trying not to," he said. The words settled deep like a stone in the riverbed. That night they did part ways at the hall. They stood outside her door a long while. He didn't ask, she didn't offer. But his hand brushed hers, knuckles grazing knuckles, a tether woven from silence. It wasn't love, not entirely. But it was something that held, even when the world gave no reason to. September brought fire to the leaves, a slow blaze of gold and rust that crept across the hills like memory, returning to a place long quiet. The air turned sharp at dawn, breath blooming in puffs that lingered above the coffee pot. The morning stretched longer now, the sun hesitant in its climb. And with the changing season came a deepening of the quiet between Sarah and James, no longer uncertain but filled with weight, with presence. They begun to share meals more deliberately. James lingered after supper now, elbows on the table, eyes not always on his plate. Sarah, too, let herself sit longer after the food was gone, hands resting in her lap, ankles crossed beneath her chair. Sometimes she told stories, small things, the time her brother Henry tied her braid to the wagon wheel, how her mother used to whistle lullabies under her breath while washing linens. James didn't always speak in return, but when he did, it came from some place low and sure. I saw my first snowfall in Tennessee, he told her once, eyes distant. Didn't know cold could be quiet like that. Sarah smiled faintly. It's the silence I miss most after winter passes. The work never stopped. The final harvest came late, stubborn and sparse. The pumpkins were small, the corn dry at the edges. Still, they gathered every ear and every gourd, stacking them with care in the cellar beneath the kitchen. James made a shelf for her jars, and she labeled each one in tidy pencil strokes. At night, she began leaving her door ajar. It was not an invitation, not exactly, just a gesture, a softening. James would pass by with measured steps, sometimes pausing. She could hear him breathe in the hallway, feel the floor shift beneath his weight. And then he'd move on, letting the dark close behind him. One evening, after a day spent butchering a hog from a neighbor's share, they sat by the hearth. The fire snapped and settled, and Sarah rolled yarn between her fingers, too weary to knit. James sharpened a knife in slow, even strokes, the sound steady and familiar. You ever miss where you came from? She asked. He set the blade down. Not the place, he said after a moment. But I miss who I thought I'd be by now. Sarah looked into the flames. Me too. The silence between them didn't ache the way it used to. It held them both, like a worn quilt pulled tight against the chill. That night when she rose to go to bed, James stood too. I'll walk you, he said, though the house was still and no danger lay in shadow. She nodded, and together they moved down the hallway, the oil lamp casting their twin silhouettes against the walls. At her door they paused. I could leave it open, she said, quiet. His eyes searched hers. Not tonight, he said, voice gentle, but soon. The first frost came like a whisper, silvery breath draped over the garden beds. Sarah covered what she could with burlap sacks and blankets. James split wood, piling it neat by the door. Their hands brushed now without flinching, and sometimes, in the quiet spaces of late afternoon, he would reach for her elbow as she passed, grounding her, just for a second. One afternoon, while tending to the last of the potatoes, she felt a pull in her back and sank to her knees, breath caught. James was there before she could cry out, lifting her gently, arms steady beneath hers. He didn't speak as he carried her to the porch, didn't let go even after she was seated. You all right? He asked, crouching beside her. She nodded, hand pressed to her side. Just a twist. It'll pass. But he stayed there, kneeling, his hand on her knee. Let me carry more of it, he said. She reached for his hand, held it. You already do. When he leaned forward and rested his forehead against her arm, it wasn't a kiss. But it was something near to prayer, a surrender, a promise not yet spoken but lived. They sat there as the sun sank low, wrapped in the hush of leaves falling one by one. It still wasn't love, not in the way stories tell it. But it was no longer survival either. It was something steadier, stitched from every ordinary moment they'd shared, something that asked nothing and offered everything. October arrived brittle and bone-colored, each day shorter than the last. The sun rose low and slow, casting long shadows that lingered across the fields like ghosts reluctant to leave. The air bit sharper now, and breath curled from their mouths even at midday. The animals grew restless, sensing change, and the house itself began to groan in the cold, timbers settling, floors warping, the past speaking through wood. It was James who came to her one night, not with urgency, but with quiet certainty. The hallway was dark save for the soft flicker of lamplight behind him. Sarah heard his steps before she saw his shape, the sound familiar now, welcome. He stood at her door, hand against the frame. If the offer still stands, he said. She moved aside without a word, and he stepped in. They didn't rush. They didn't touch at first. He sat on the edge of the bed while she undid her braid, fingers working loose the day. He watched her in silence, as he always had, never claiming, only seeing. When she finally lay down, he joined her, not with hunger but with reverence. His hand found hers beneath the quilt. Their fingers laced, and they slept that way, back to back, breath steady, as if the simple act of sharing a bed could stitch together the frayed pieces of two broken lives. It was not a beginning or an ending. It was a choosing. They didn't speak of it the next day, nor the one after. But something between them had settled, like water after a stone has been thrown, ripples fading into calm. James no longer knocked before entering her space. She began leaving her shawl on the peg by his door. Small things, subtle things, But in a world where even the smallest grace could carry the weight of salvation, they were everything. Then came the snow. Not the kind that flirts with the earth and melts by noon, but the deep, white silence that covers all sin. It fell in thick veils, day after day, until the porch vanished beneath it, and the barn became a pale shape across the field. The world shrank to the size of the house and the breath within it. Sarah took to baking in earnest, her hands moving with purpose through flour and lard, memory guiding her through recipes long buried. James repaired harnesses by the fire, the scent of leather and smoke filling the parlor. Their lives became a ritual of warmth, mending, making, surviving. One morning he found her in the parlor, staring at the window as snow curled against the glass. "You miss them?" he asked, voice low. She nodded without turning. "Some days more than others." James stepped closer, resting his hand on her shoulder. "Tell me about your mother," he said, so she did. And then he told her about the boy he'd grown up beside in Missouri, the one who didn't come back from the war, the one whose name he still said under his breath when the nights got too quiet. Their stories became a kind of map, charting the country of grief and longing that lay between them, and each telling closed the distance a little more. When the snowstorm broke a window pane one night with a wind that howled like morning, they nailed boards across it together. Sarah held the lantern, James the hammer. Their hands brushed, and this time he did not let hers go. "We could fix this properly come spring," he said. She looked up at him, eyes steady. "We will." Later, by the fire, he touched her hair for the first time. Just his fingertips, barely there, as if memorizing the shape of her without taking anything from her. She leaned into the touch, not because she was cold, but because she no longer needed to be brave alone. They began to speak more, not always in words, a nod across the kitchen, a glance when the fire popped. The kind of language that builds not from noise but from the act of staying. Outside, the world was white and endless. But inside the house, the days gathered heat, breath, and the small flickers of something softer than survival. Something that lived in the quiet spaces between chores and sleep. They still didn't say love, but they no longer had to. Winter burned long that year, clinging to the hills like a penance. Snow layered thick upon the barn roof and hardened the paths between house and woodshed to brittle white ruts. The creek froze over clean, and in the stillest hours of dawn, Sarah could hear it groaning beneath the ice. The Wilkins place shrank to its bones, and so did they, paring life down to what was needed, and then to what was chosen. Inside, the days bent gentle. James took to reading aloud in the evenings, old almanacs and dusty books left from her father's shelf. His voice, rough-hewn but steady, filled the rooms like a slow melody. Sarah listened while she mended, the thread sliding smooth through cloth, her hands remembering tasks passed down through generations of women who'd waited out winters with only silence and grit for company. Sometimes they danced, not often, not planned, but there were moments when the fire crackled just right, or when James returned from the woods with his beard rimmed in frost and a smile behind his eyes, that Sarah would hum a tune low and wandering. And James, with a quiet that had become second nature, would hold out his hand. They moved slowly, the worn boards of the kitchen floor creaking beneath their steps, his hand at the small of her back, her cheek brushing the wool of his shirt. There was no music save her humming, no rhythm save the rise and fall of breath. But in those few minutes, they were not people bound by necessity. They were simply man and woman, alive in the warmth of the house they'd built from ruin. In the first week of February, James fell ill. It began with a cough, a small thing, rough and barking. He brushed it off, said it was nothing. But Sarah heard the rattle behind his words and saw how the lines deepened around his mouth when he stood too fast. By the third day, he was too weak to leave bed. She tended him without asking, moving between their rooms with basin and cloth, broth and tea. She sat beside him through the dark hours, wiping sweat from his brow, whispering his name when he twisted in fevered dreams. Once, when the fever broke and his eyes found hers, he reached up and touched her face with a tenderness that split something inside her. "I never meant to stay," he murmured. "But now I can't think of anywhere else." Tears came then, silent and hot, sliding down her cheeks unchecked. "You don't have to mean it," she said. "You just have to keep choosing it." He smiled, faint and real. "I do." The sickness passed, slow as thaw. Each day he grew stronger, voice regaining its weight, shoulders squaring again beneath the quilt. And Sarah, worn and hollow from the watching, found herself leaning against the doorframe some evenings, just to look at him breathing. When spring finally came, it did so without fanfare. The snow receded in patches, revealing the damp, black bones of the earth beneath. The first crocus pushed its pale face up through the thaw near the well, and Sarah touched it like an offering. They began to repair what the storm and winter had left behind. Together, fence posts reset, window panes replaced with new glass that caught the morning light like promise. In the orchard, James built her a bench from scrapwood, and she planted new saplings with his coat slung over her shoulders. One afternoon, she came upon him mending the edge of the porch. He looked up, sun in his hair, dirt beneath his nails, and something in her stilled. "You're still here," she said, not as question but truth. James stood, brushed his hands on his trousers, and met her gaze. "I'll be here," he said. "Long as you'll have me." She crossed to him, rested her palm against his chest, felt the slow, steady beat beneath it. "I already have." No vows were spoken, none were needed. Theirs was not a story made of ceremony, but of hands held through storms and silence, of shared coffee in the pre-dawn cold, of splinters and mended shirts and laughter so rare it sounded like birds returning after frost. Love had not arrived all at once. It had gathered like rain in a barrel, slow and silent, until one day they looked and found it full. They were not saved by marriage. They were softened by it, by the staying. By the choice remade daily to see one another through the storm and the stillness, through hunger and healing, and the quiet, ordinary grace of two lives made into one, not by fire, but by ash, and by what rose from it. In Elkalo, folks still talked, but these days, when they spoke of James and Sarah Holt, they did so with something like reverence, not because of how they began, but because of how they stayed.